Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Chavav begins with a Mishnah discussing the halacha of an animal which is a bechor, which may have potentially got a mum on Yom Tov. It will be a machokis whether or not you're allowed to declare it as being a bechor with a mum, and whether or not you're allowed to slaughter it. This will take us throughout the daf, as we'll bring in another brisa which we'll compare to this Mishnah, compare the Mishnah and the brisa, and try to understand the different opinions in the brisa and what they all refer to. So let's get some background here. A bechor is an animal which is firstborn. It has kedushas bechor. It is kachim from a birth. From the moment of its birth, it has a kedusha of a carbon, because it has to be brought as a carbon for kohanim. It's the only animal today without a Beis Hamikdash where we're not maknish anything that still has kedushas carbon, and therefore it has to stay left alone until it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, then you can redeem it. You can use it for your own purposes. So bechor is pretty much useless. It's a liability until it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, you're allowed to slaughter it. Now, when it gets a mum, you need a chacham, you need an expert to paskin that this mum is a permanent mum. That is, this is an injury which is not going to ever fully heal, and this disqualifies it from being a carbon, and it is now shechtable. If it has a mum and you did not bring a chacham to paskin it, you cannot shecht it just based on that. Now, the Mishnah discusses where a bechor fell into a hole. And the question is, it's Yom Tov, are you allowed to paskin that it has a mum or not, and are you allowed to take it out of the hole or not, and are you allowed to shecht it? Now, there are two issues. One issue is, are you allowed to paskin a mum on Yom Tov? Could be that you're not allowed to do that. The Gemara will explain why. Another issue is that it could be this animal's muktzah. It didn't have a mum when Yom Tov began, therefore there was nothing you could do with it. You couldn't shecht it. Now that it got a mum, maybe that doesn't count. Or maybe it had a mum before Yom Tov, and you just didn't know about it. Or maybe you always have in mind that it might get a mum on Yom Tov. Is it muktzah? Is it not muktzah? What's the story with this? So the Mishnah begins and has a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, the two classic disputants about the concept of muktzah. And here Rabbi Yehuda says that if this animal which is bechor falls into a hole on Shabbos, get an expert, get a mumcha to go down into the hole, look at the mum, paskin it. If it's a good mum, then you can take it out and you can shecht it. If not, then you're not allowed to shecht it. Rabbi Shimon says it's got to have a mum before Yom Tov. If it gets a mum on Yom Tov, it does not count. So now the Gemara wants to understand what this machlokas is about. And the Gemara notices that if it's about muktzah, then the opinions are reversed. Generally, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that something that is not set aside for a specific use is muktzah. And Rabbi Shimon is the one who says that it is not muktzah. But here, Rabbi Shimon is the one who says that you cannot shecht this animal, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can. So the Gemara therefore says machlokas is not about muktzah. We're talking about an animal that had a mum before Yom Tov. And the argument is not about muktzah, the argument is about something else. The argument is, are you allowed to paskin a mum on Yom Tov or not? Is it considered to be fixing the animal, making it useful? It's a tikkun of the animal to declare that it has a kosher mum. It's similar to holding a court case, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos or Yom Tov either. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to paskin the mum, and therefore you can bring a chacham to go look at this animal and paskin the mum. According to Rabbi Shimon, you're not allowed to paskin a mum on Yom Tov, and therefore you have to just leave it and you can't shecht it. The Gemara says this is a nice explanation, but it has a major problem. Why are we talking about an animal that fell down a hole? Just talk about an animal that has a mum from before Yom Tov. Are you allowed to paskin it or not? Somebody says, no, we are discussing an animal that fell down a hole because we want to introduce another halacha, and that's that you're not allowed to take the animal out of the hole. It would be forbidden to lift it out of the hole unless you have a purpose for it, unless you want to do an actual shechita. Somebody says, why would I think that you should be allowed to take the animal out of the hole? How should you be allowed to if it's muktzah? Somebody says, tzar b'lichayim, pain that's close to the animal. You may think that you have a way to get the animal out. How so? You'll pull a trick. You'll say, I'm going to take the animal out of the hole to shecht it. Oh, then once it's out of the hole, I realize, I have to check it and see if its mum is good or not. And now I don't know if I could, so now I have to bring somebody to paskin. All right, but at least I got the animal out of the hole. Now, we've seen similar concept. You're allowed to do things like that to get animals out of holes. We've seen a similar thing. If you have two animals in a hole, one is a mother and one is a child, you're only allowed to shecht one of them, but you get to decide which one. You're allowed to take one out and say, I'm going to shecht that one, then say, I changed my mind, I want to shecht the other one, and then take the other one out of the hole. So there are such things you're allowed to do sometimes, but here this is not a case where you're allowed to do that. You're not allowed to pull that shtick. You're not allowed to get it out of the hole. So Mar says that cannot be what this halacha is, because if that's what you're trying to teach me by telling me a case where the animal fell into a hole, then you should say, don't take it out of the hole. You should say, in the case where the animal does not have a good mum and you're not allowed to shecht, you should say don't take it out. But it doesn't say don't take it out. It says don't shecht it, don't slaughter it. So you're missing the point. So the Gemara says, no, okay, so there are two halachas here. And the fact that it says you have to send the expert down into the hole and check the mum before you take it out, that teaches me that you can't do this trick and take it out first. And by saying lo yishchay, that's teaching me something else. That is teaching me that even if you went ahead and you took it out of the hole illegally, against the rules, you took it out of the hole, now you can't go ahead and shecht it if it doesn't have a mum. You can't say, well, once I have it out of the hole, let me shecht it. Says, what do you mean shecht it? How could you shecht it if it doesn't have a mum? There's no mum, it's kachim. He says, no, we're referring to where it didn't have a mum from before and it got a mum now. So that means that the chiddush is as follows. We say don't shecht it, we're coming to teach me another halacha. If you took the animal out of the hole without checking the mum, which you were not allowed to do, and you wanted to just save the animal from pain, whatever it was, and you took it out, and now you look at it and you say, oh, the mum that it had from before Yom Tov is not a good mum, that's a temporary mum, but it just got a mum now. So I should officially be not allowed to shecht it now, because it did not have a mum before Yom Tov, and it was muktzah before Yom Tov. But I'm allowed to shecht it now. I would think I'm allowed to shecht it now because it has a mum now. When it comes to teach me, you're not allowed to do that because it did not have a mum before Yom Tov, and therefore it's a muktzah. Now this is all in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, of course. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says you're not allowed to do shchita here if you took the animal out, right? Where Shimon says you're never allowed to do shchita. So the Gemara says this is not a chiddush. That's not a good chiddush. We know that Rabbi Yehuda holds of muktzah. That's a classic concept which we've always seen. So the Gemara says no. It's not so clear. We're talking about a case where it had a temporary mum before Yom Tov, and that temporary mum turned into a permanent mum on Yom Tov. You may think that it's not muktzah, because people, when they see temporary mum, they're already thinking, ooh, it's got a mum before Yom Tov, maybe I'll get a chance to shecht it. And therefore they already have in mind that they're going to eat this thing when Yom Tov begins, and therefore it's not muktzah. That's what you might think. The chiddush therefore is that this is considered to be muktzah. Okay, that's the Gemara's explanation of this Mishnah. Now the Gemara brings a very similar brisa. Except instead of being a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, which are Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, it's machlokes between a different Rabbi Yehuda and a different Rabbi Shimon. It's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. They are 2 generations later. They have a very similar machlokes, and the Gemara analyzes it at length. So first of all, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, says pretty much the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, which is that you're not allowed to, which is that you send an expert into the hole to check the animal if it has a mum. If it has a mum, then you can slaughter it. If it doesn't, then you're not allowed to slaughter it. Now, the only thing that's different is that he says clearly that this animal is a bechor tam. It's an animal which did not have a mum before. It was only got a mum now. And therefore, it is definitely not a question of muktzah. Muktzah is not the issue here. There's no possibility that this is a machlokes about muktzah. And the Gemara goes to the same back and forth about what the discussion is, what the machlokes is. The Gemara comes to the same determination, except it leaves off the last step, because this is not Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. We didn't know what he held about muktzah. And therefore it could be that what he's teaching me is that when the animal gets a mum on Yom Tov, that's called muktzah, and that's why you're not allowed to shecht it if you took it out of the hole against the rules. Okay, that means to say that you check the mum that it had from before. The Gemara adds in here that it had one before. The mum was no good. You took the animal out of the hole against the rules. Now it got a mum. You're not allowed to shecht based on that mum because it was muktzah from before. That's Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi's opinion. Then the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya introduces our old machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi against Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. That is to say, Shimon ben Menasya is the later of Shimon. He's in this brisa arguing against Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And he's saying this concept, this whole discussion about this mum business is already machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the Tanaim generations earlier. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya introduces the machlokes, and he divides the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the one who says that you're not allowed to check mum and Yom Tov. He divides it into 3 cases. The 3 cases are if the mum was there before Yom Tov, it just wasn't checked yet until Yom Tov. Now you want to check it on Yom Tov. That's case 1. Case 2 is if the mum only arrived on Yom Tov. And case 3 is if the entire animal only arrived on Yom Tov. That is, the animal was born on Yom Tov and it has a mum on it. Are you allowed to check it then? So the Gemara, in its first understanding here, at least, of how Rav Shimon ben Menasya is explaining the opinion of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, sets it up as follows. In the first case, where the mum was there before Yom Tov, and you want to check it now on Yom Tov, l'chadchila, you're not supposed to check it. That's a violation. You're doing a tikkun. You're judging a case on Yom Tov. You're not supposed to do that. If you did it, however, it's good enough. That's okay. and you're allowed to shecht it because the mum was already there. All you needed was a little tiny thing. You needed the chacham to come and to look at it. Okay, you weren't supposed to do that, but if you did, you didn't really do that much. The tikkun was already around. However, if the mum only came on yontif, there you're not allowed to check it, and even if you do check it and you find that it's a good mum, you can't shecht it because it only became metukin, only became fixed now on yontif. The third case, however, where it was born a yontif with a mum with it right away, there Rav Shimon agrees to Rabbi Yehuda that you're allowed to shecht it, you're allowed to check it, you're allowed to paskin everything, it's not a problem. And the reason the Gemara explains is because since it was born, it never had a status of Isser. While it was still a fetus, you were allowed to eat it because you could shecht the mother, and that shechita would work for the child as well. When it was born, talking about a case where you could see it as it was coming out, as it had a mum, and you had 3 dayanim sitting there, and a paskin that it had a mum right away. There was never a status in which it was forbidden, that you had to go ask a question. It went straight from being mutter because it was a fetus and a kosher animal, to being permitted because it was a mum-bearing bechar. It was never anything else in between. The Gemara now quotes a machlekes amarayim is, how do you understand the halacha here? We're saying you're allowed to paskin it in the case where it was born with its mum. You're allowed to paskin lechatchila. I'm allowed to go paskin it. That's permitted. Or once I paskin it, now I'm allowed to shachta. What are we saying? So Rabbi Bar Rav Huna says you're allowed to go lechatchila and give that psak. Rav Nachman disagreed. Rav Nachman said your father learned differently and said only if you were not supposed to paskin it, but if you did go ahead and paskin it, then you're allowed to do shechita. So the Gemara says that Abaye says that the structure, the way Rav Shimon Menashe set things up here, sounds like Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. Sounds like there's 3 different halachas. He said 3 different cases. Why did he divide Rav Shimon's halacha into 3 different cases? Because he had 3 different halachas. One is that you're not allowed to check it at all. One is that you're not supposed to check it, but if you do, then you're allowed to shecht it. And one is that you're allowed to lechatchila check it. That would mean that this case you're lechatchila allowed to go. If you're only allowed to shecht it, but you weren't allowed to check it lechatchila, so then it comes out the same as the first case where the mum was there before Yom Tov. You should put those 2 cases together as one. So the Gemara says, okay, that's a good proof. The problem is that this is not necessarily the correct version of this Mishnah. There's a different version of this Mishnah which is brought by Rav Oishia, in which he does put 2 cases together. He says whether the whether the animal got a mum on Erev Yontif or it got the mum on Yontif. Either way, those 2 cases are put together, and you're not allowed to shecht it at all. That's one case. You're not allowed to shecht those together. Those 2 halachas are the same. Now, that's not how we had the halacha. We had that if the mum was there before Yontif, you're allowed to shecht it. You weren't allowed to check it, but you're allowed to shecht it. But according to Oshi's version of this Mishnah, that halacha is the same as the middle case, and in both cases, you're not allowed to shecht it, even if you checked it. You're not allowed to check it, you're not allowed to shecht it. So that being the case, those 2 are together, then the only halacha that remains left out is our case of where it was born with a mum on it on Yontif, and there you are allowed to shecht. The question, which we're still stuck with, is are you allowed to check it or not? And that's as machlokes Rabbi Bar Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, are you allowed to check it? Either way, it will be a different halacha than what we're saying in the other cases, which is that you're not even allowed to shecht it even if you checked it. So we no longer have a proof. So Abaye's support for Rabbi Bar Huna's position falls off because this case will be different than the other cases, no matter what it is. Whether it's a lechatchila or a b'diavad, it'll still be different than the other cases. So the Gemara accepts that. The Gemara wants to know that these 2 mishnayos are now contradictory. What is the halacha in the case of the animal that had a mum that arrived before Yontif and it did not check it? Are you allowed to check it? We know you're not allowed to check it. But are you allowed to shecht it or not? We have 2 contradictory mishnayos about that. Our version says you're allowed to. Rav Oish's version says you're not. So Gemara says our version's wrong. Our version is the version that was brought by a certain Chacham who often got his mishnayos, his name is Ada Bar Uchmi, and he got his mishnayos wrong all the time. And therefore that's why this is a messed up version. And the other version is the correct version. Says the Gemara, we could go ahead and prove to you that that's the case. If you look at our original Mishnah that we started the daf with, where Rabbi Shimon, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, is responding to Yehuda Bar Ilai, and he says the following phrase. He says, anything which does not have a mum nicker before Yontif, you're not allowed to do anything with it. It's called Eina min hamuchan. It has to have a mum nicker. So what does it mean it doesn't have a mum nicker? It means that you were not aware of any mum at all. Mum did not exist. You had no knowledge of a mum. So why does he have to tell Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi that's Einay Min HaMuchan? Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi is one who holds of Muktzah. He's the one who says that that's for sure Aser. There was nothing wrong with this animal before Yom Tov began. It's Muktzah 100%. There's no reason why you would ever think of eating it. So it's got to be that we're talking about where it had a mum, but the mum just wasn't checked by a chacham. And that's the case that Rosh Shimon was referring to. And Rosh Shimon clearly says that the halacha is you're not allowed to do anything with it. You're not allowed to check it. You're not allowed to shacht it. Even if you checked it, you're not allowed to shacht it. It's all forbidden. And that supports Rav Oshi's version of Rav Shimon's opinion, and therefore that's the one we're going to go with. Okay, the Gemara now switches gears and goes into a different topic, and that's the topic of Muktzah L'Chatzi Shabbos. Muktzah L'Chatzi Shabbos means as follows. Usually, the status of an object over the entire Shabbos is determined by the beginning moments of Shabbos. If it was Muktzah in the beginning of Shabbos, it stays Muktzah for the entire Shabbos. If it was not Muktzah in the beginning of Shabbos, it's not Muktzah. Everything's fine. Question here, which is asked by Hillel to Rava, is what is the halacha if it became Muktzah part of Shabbos? So one tries to figure out what's the case exactly. If it was Muktzah when Shabbos began, it's Muktzah the whole Shabbos. If it's not Muktzah when Shabbos began, it's not Muktzah the whole Shabbos. Versus the cases where it became Muktzah in the middle of Shabbos, does that extend after Shabbos even if the status of Muktzah went off? So what would be an example? An example would be if you put figs up on the roof to dry, or you put grapes to turn into raisins. Now, the status of these is as follows. While they're drying, they're inedible. When they're fresh grapes, you can eat them. When they're dried raisins, you can eat them. When they're half dried, they're useless. So in that middle state, it's totally not usable. So now, what this guy did is he put them up on the roof to dry in the sun. They were still useful at the beginning of Shabbos. He could have eaten them as grapes. They became useless while it was Shabbos, therefore they became Muktzah. The question is now what happens when they became back to being useful. The Gemara describes the case a little bit, Rashi describes the case a little bit differently. He says that they were dried, they were drying and they were useless, and then it rained on them, so it became moist again. So then they became back to being useful, and then they became, so then the question is, do they stay usher now? So again, the question is, you have objects which started Shabbos useful, not Muktzah. When they became useless on Shabbos, while they're useless, they're certainly Muktzah. There's nothing you could do with them. But then that status, that situation expired, and now they're technically useful. Do we say that the concept of Muktzah extends, even though it wasn't Muktzah when Shabbos began, but it was Muktzah previously on Shabbos, and therefore it stays Muktzah? That's the question. So the Gemara attempts to bring a few proofs to this. The Gemara's first proof is from our very discussion about the animal which was born on Shabbos with a mum. And the Gemara says this is our case. It started Shabbos. It was, let's make it Yom Tov. Shabbos would be Asr. It started Yom Tov. You could have shachted it and eaten it because it was part of its mother, like we said before. When one is born, so now it's Asr. It's a Bechar. Then you found the mum, now it became Mutter. So this is a situation where it had a temporary status of Isser on Yom Tov. And we don't say that status continues until after Yom Tov, even though you find the mum. We say that once it finds the mum, it's okay. So there's two versions as to whether this helps or hurts somebody. The Gemara says that the question was asked, and the answer is two versions of what the answer was given. Either he said that it is Muktzah or that it's not Muktzah, but this is a proof that it should be considered not Muktzah. So either it's a proof to what he said or it's a proof against what he said. But either way, the Gemara's answer is, like we said earlier, that it never had a moment in which it was not considered to be permitted, because it was born with the mum right away, even before its birth was completed and before it became a Bechar. It already had its mum visible, and the judges were sitting there and they were able to paskin it instantly. The Gemara now brings another proof. This is from a Beitzah which discusses somebody who was eating, could be grapes, figs, peaches, or quinces. He was eating these things, and he decided to put it up on the roof to dry. He brings it up on the roof to dry at the beginning of Shabbos or Yom Tov, whatever it is. So the Beitzah says the halacha is that it's muktzah unless he was mazmin it, unless he specifically said, I plan on eating these, that I have in mind to eat them. Unless he was mazmin it and he said that I still consider it useful, it becomes a muktzah. He says, now what's the case over here exactly? If it's totally fit to eat still, there's nothing wrong with it, it didn't dry to the point that it's not edible, so then why does he have to be mazmin it? If it's not edible, so what does it help to be mazmin it? So must be talking about something in between. So what's the in-between case? So the Gemara first tries, well, maybe it's talking about where he didn't go up to the roof to check. When Shabbos began, he didn't check to see if it was edible or not. It was too much of a schlep for him to go up to the roof, and therefore he didn't bother to check. So then it depends on what he said. If he said that I have in mind that I want to use it, so then if it's good, it's good. Otherwise, it isn't good. Someone says that cannot be the case because we know that the halacha in that case is that he doesn't have to be mazmin it. If it's good, it's good even without his hazmana. Yeah, you don't need to have hazmana if it was ready to be eaten then. So the Gemara says, so the case must therefore be our case, that it was good and then it became no good and then it became good again. And there you need hazmana. So the Gemara says again, the question would be though, why do you need hazmana? If it's not considered mukta, why would you have to have hazmana? And if it is considered mukta, what is hazmana going to help? During the time that it's not edible, hazmana isn't worth anything, and if it stays mukta, so hazmana is not going to do anything for you. So the Gemara therefore says the actual pshat here is a different case. It's talking about where it was a kind of middle level. It wasn't really edible, but it wasn't impossible to eat. It was kind of gross, but it was still edible. And then it depends on what you think. If you mentally disengage from it, it's mukta. If, however, you still consider it foods, then it's not mukta, and that's why you need hazmana. So that's the case here, and it has nothing to do with our question of mukta l'chatzi Shabbos.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.